What drives a person to the edge? What festering darkness can take root in a family, turning love into a currency and life into a commodity? We often believe that the most monstrous acts are committed by strangers, by shadowy figures lurking in the alleys of our nightmares. But sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we invite into our homes, the ones who share our blood. The story you are about to hear is a chilling testament to that truth. It's a tale of greed, betrayal, and a darkness so profound it threatens to consume everything it touches. Before we delve into this harrowing account, if you're drawn to stories that explore the shadowy corners of human nature, make sure you click that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming. Our story begins not in the smoldering ruins of a crime scene, but in the deceptive tranquility of a sun-drenched suburban home, a place that, to any outsider, would seem the very picture of familial bliss. But behind the manicured lawns and freshly painted facade, a different kind of fire was already burning. The scent of lemon polish and old money clung to the air in Eleanor Vance's sprawling Victorian home, a fragrance that had been a constant in her grandson's life. 22-year-old Julian Vance had grown up within these hallowed, and to him, suffocating walls. To the outside world, he was the doting grandson of a wealthy widow, a young man with a charming smile and an easy grace that spoke of a privileged upbringing. He was a student at a prestigious university, drove a car that was a gift for his 21st birthday, and was always impeccably dressed. But beneath the carefully constructed veneer of gratitude and affection, a venomous resentment had been taking root for years. Eleanor, at 78, was a woman forged in the crucible of a bygone era. Her late husband, a man who had built a modest fortune in manufacturing, had left her with a portfolio of investments that had blossomed into a formidable estate. She was a woman of routine and unwavering principles, her days dictated by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the rigid social etiquette of her generation. Her love for Julian was genuine, but it was a love encased in expectation and control. She saw him not just as her grandson, but as the sole heir to the Vance legacy, a legacy she was determined to see upheld to her exacting standards. Julian's parents had perished in a car accident when he was just 10, a tragedy that had placed him directly under Eleanor's formidable wing. In the beginning, he had clung to her, his small hand lost in her wrinkled one, finding a semblance of security in her steadfast presence. But as he grew, that security began to feel like a gilded cage. Every decision, from the clothes he wore to the friends he made, was subject to her scrutiny and, more often than not, her thinly veiled disapproval. His passions were dismissed as frivolous, his ambitions as misguided. He had a talent for art, a desire to create, but Eleanor saw no value in a life spent with paint-stained fingers. "The Vances are patrons of the arts, Julian," she would say, her voice a mixture of pride and admonition. "Not the ones creating the mess." The financial control was absolute. Julian was given a generous allowance, enough to maintain the appearance of wealth among his peers, but it came with strings attached. Every expenditure was tracked, every withdrawal questioned. He was a wealthy young man with no real wealth of his own. The grand inheritance, the key to the life he truly craved, was a tantalizing mirage, always shimmering on the horizon but forever out of reach as long as Eleanor drew breath. His university life was a carefully curated performance. He majored in business, a subject that bored him to tears, simply to appease his grandmother. His grades were respectable, but his heart was not in it. The real Julian emerged in the late hours, in the dimly lit corners of the city that Eleanor knew nothing about. He had a taste for the high life, a penchant for gambling that started with small, illicit poker games in the backrooms of bars and had steadily escalated. He craved the thrill of the risk, the fleeting sense of control that came with a winning hand, a feeling so absent in his real life. But more often than not, he lost, and the debts began to accumulate like a gathering storm. He owed money to people who did not send polite reminders, men with hard eyes and no patience for sob stories about overbearing grandmothers. The pressure was mounting, a physical weight that settled in his chest, making it hard to breathe in the polished, airless rooms of Eleanor's house. He started selling off the few valuable items. He truly owned a watch from his father, a first-edition book he treasured. But these were mere drops in an ocean of debt. The idea, when it first slithered into his mind, was so monstrous, so utterly unthinkable, that he recoiled from it in horror. It was a fleeting thought, a wisp of black smoke in the maelstrom of his desperation, but it did not dissipate. It lingered, returning at his weakest moments, whispering of a permanent solution. The whispers grew louder with each threatening phone call, with each new demand for payment. The catalyst came on a Tuesday afternoon, a day like any other in the Vance household. Julian had been summoned to his grandmother's study, a room paneled in dark mahogany and lined with leather-bound books that no one ever read. Eleanor sat behind her large, ornate desk, a fortress of wood and tradition, her back ramrod straight. She held a bank statement in her hand, her long, bony fingers tapping a silent, ominous rhythm on its surface. "Julian," she began, her voice devoid of its usual warmth, "we need to discuss this." She slid the statement across the polished wood. Julian's eyes darted down to the highlighted figures, a series of large cash withdrawals he had made over the past month, desperate attempts to placate his creditors. "I can explain," he started, the lie already forming on his lips. "It was for a university project, a short film. We needed to rent equipment, hire actors." Eleanor raised a hand, silencing him. "Do not insult my intelligence, Julian. I spoke with your faculty advisor this morning. Professor Albright was quite perplexed. He informed me there are no such projects on your curriculum." The blood drained from Julian's face. He felt trapped, a specimen under a microscope. Her network of contacts, her influence, was something he always underestimated. I made a mistake," he stammered, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. "I've been under a lot of pressure." "Pressure?" she scoffed, her eyes like chips of ice. "You know nothing of pressure. You have been given every advantage, every opportunity to build a respectable life for yourself. And you squander it on what? Vices? Reckless pursuits? I have indulged your whims for far too long, hoping you would mature, that you would grow into the man your father was. It seems I was mistaken." She opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a thick file. "I have had a private investigator look into your activities, Julian. The gambling, the debts, the disreputable individuals you associate with." She let the file drop onto the desk with a heavy thud. "It ends now. Your allowance is suspended indefinitely. You will withdraw from your current classes. I have already arranged for you to take a position at the accounting firm of my dear friend, Arthur Covington. You will start on Monday. You will work, and you will begin to understand the value of a dollar earned through honest labor. Your debts will be dealt with, but not without consequence. Every penny will be deducted from your future inheritance." Julian stared at her, his mind reeling. An accounting firm, a life of spreadsheets and ledgers, a life under the watchful eye of one of his grandmother's cronies. It was a prison sentence. And the final blow, the mention of his inheritance, the one thing that had kept him going, being whittled away to pay for his mistakes. Something inside him snapped. The simmering resentment, the years of feeling controlled and belittled, boiled over into a cold, clear rage. In that moment, looking at the proud, unyielding woman behind the desk, he didn't see his grandmother. He saw an obstacle, a beautifully dressed, elegantly coiffed, 78-year-old roadblock to his freedom. The monstrous thought returned, no longer a whisper but a roar. He said nothing. He simply stood up, his face a mask of stony indifference, and walked out of the study. The click of the heavy door shutting behind him was a sound of finality. It was the sound of a line being crossed, a point of no return. The days that followed were a blur of calculated deception. To Eleanor, Julian appeared contrite, chastened. He was quiet, respectful, and agreed to all her terms without argument. He packed away his art supplies, folded the expensive clothes she had bought him, and spoke of his impending job at the accounting firm with a feigned sense of resignation. Eleanor, believing her harsh measures had finally shocked him into compliance, allowed herself a small measure of relief. She mistook his silence for remorse, his obedience for a change of heart. She had no idea it was the calm before the storm. In reality, Julian's mind was a whirlwind of dark calculations. The rage had cooled, replaced by a chillingly pragmatic focus. He needed a plan, a way to remove the obstacle permanently, and to do it in a way that would leave no trace back to him. He was a business major, after all. He understood risk assessment, cost-benefit analysis. The benefit was clear: an inheritance worth millions, freedom, a life on his own terms. The cost of failure was a lifetime in prison. The risk had to be managed. He knew he couldn't do it himself. He lacked the nerve, the stomach for violence. The thought of physically harming his grandmother, of seeing the life drain from her eyes, was something his mind shied away from. But paying someone else to do it? That was a transaction, a business deal. It created a layer of separation, a psychological buffer that made the unthinkable seem possible. His search for a hitman began in the very world that had caused his downfall. He started asking discreet questions in the back-alley poker rooms, using the coded language of the desperate. He was looking for a problem solver, someone who could handle a delicate situation. Most of the small-time criminals he knew laughed him off or looked at him with suspicion. He was a rich kid playing a dangerous game, but his persistence, and the subtle hints of a large payday, eventually led him to a name: Silas. Silas was a name spoken in hushed tones, a semi-legendary figure in the city's underbelly. He was not a common thug. He was, as one nervous informant put it, a professional. He was expensive, discreet, and utterly ruthless. Finding him was not easy. It involved a series of clandestine meetings, blind drops, and burner phones. Julian felt a perverse thrill in this new, secret life, a sense of power and control he had never known. He was no longer the subservient grandson. He was a player in a deadly game. The first meeting was arranged in a desolate, rain-slicked industrial park on the outskirts of the city. Julian sat in his car, the engine off, his heart pounding against his ribs. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, gaunt man with a face that seemed to be carved from stone. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace that sent a shiver down Julian's spine. This was Silas. He slid into the passenger seat without a word, the car dipping slightly under his weight. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken menace. Julian, for all his newfound confidence, found his voice trembling when he finally spoke. "You're Silas." The man just looked at him, his eyes dark and empty. "You have a problem you need solved." It wasn't a question. Julian swallowed hard and began to outline the plan. He spoke of his grandmother, of the house, of the inheritance. He tried to sound detached, clinical, as if he were discussing a business merger, not a murder. Silas listened impassively, his gaze never wavering. When Julian finished, the hitman finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The price is non-negotiable. Half now, half after the job is done. I choose the time, the method. You provide the layout, the schedules, the access. Once we agree, there is no backing out. You contact me, I don't contact you. Any deviation from the plan, and you will have a much bigger problem than an old woman." Julian nodded, a strange sense of calm settling over him. This was it. The deal was being made. "And the method?" he asked, his curiosity overriding his fear. Silas allowed a flicker of a smile to cross his lips, a chilling sight. "The best solutions are the ones that erase the problem and the evidence at the same time. A fire, tragic accident, old house, faulty wiring. Happens all the time. A fire." The idea was both brilliant and horrific. It would destroy everything, cover any tracks, sanitize the scene. It was clean in its own gruesome way. It would also destroy the house he grew up in, the repository of his childhood memories, both good and bad. For a fleeting moment, an image of his parents, smiling in a photograph on the mantelpiece, flashed through his mind. He pushed it away. There was no room for sentiment in this new world he had chosen. He agreed to the terms. The next few days were spent gathering the first half of the payment, a sum that required him to borrow even more heavily from a loan shark, sinking him deeper into the very world he was trying to escape. He saw it as a necessary investment, a short-term loan against a future of infinite wealth. He also began to meticulously gather the information Silas required. He drew a detailed map of the house, marking his grandmother's bedroom, the location of the old, fuse-based electrical panel in the basement, the security system's blind spots. He documented Eleanor's unwavering routine. Her bedtime at 10 o'clock sharp, the glass of warm milk she drank beforehand, the way she always locked the back door but sometimes forgot the chain. Every detail was a nail in her coffin. He had to play the part of the dutiful grandson, all while plotting the most intimate of betrayals. He ate dinner with her every night, listening to her talk about her day, about her friends, about the plans she had for the garden in the spring. He would nod and smile, a knot of ice in his stomach. One evening, she seemed particularly frail, her hand trembling as she reached for her teacup. A wave of something he almost recognized as guilt washed over him. This was the woman who had raised him, who had read him bedtime stories and soothed his childhood fears. But then she looked at him, her gaze sharpening, and said, "I spoke with Arthur today. He's very much looking forward to you starting on Monday. He says a bit of hard work will make a man out of you." And just like that, the ice returned, harder and colder than before. She would never see him as a man. She would always see him as a boy to be molded, a project to be managed. His resolve hardened. The path was chosen. The final step was to secure his alibi. It had to be airtight, unimpeachable. He arranged to spend the weekend with some university friends at a cabin several hours away, a trip he made sure to mention to his grandmother multiple times. He was so excited, he told her, to get away for a couple of days before starting his new job. On the Friday he was due to leave, he packed his bag, making a show of it for Eleanor's benefit. He hugged her goodbye at the front door, the gesture feeling alien and obscene. "I'll see you on Sunday evening, Grandma," he said, his voice perfectly steady. "Be safe, Julian," she replied, patting his cheek. "And do try to be responsible." Those were the last words she would ever say to him. He drove away from the house, the grand Victorian facade shrinking in his rearview mirror. He didn't look back. He drove for an hour, heading north, establishing his direction of travel. Then, at a prearranged spot, he pulled over. A nondescript sedan pulled up behind him. Silas was at the wheel. Julian got out, leaving his own car on the shoulder of the road, and slipped into the passenger seat of Silas's vehicle. He handed over a burner phone. "The house is empty except for her. The alarm code is the year my father was born. She turns it on at 9:30. Her bedroom is on the second floor, front of the house. She'll be asleep by 10:30. Silas took the phone and a thick envelope of cash from Julian's trembling hand. He didn't count the money. He just nodded. "Go to your friends. Have a good time. Don't answer any numbers you don't recognize. Don't come back until Sunday. The less you know about the details, the better." They drove back towards the city in silence, the darkness outside the car a reflection of the abyss that had opened up in Julian's soul. He had set the wheels in motion. The monster he had invited into his life was now on its way to his childhood home, to the woman who had raised him. There was no turning back. The fire was coming. The drive back to the city with Silas was a masterclass in unnerving silence. Julian sat rigid in the passenger seat, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles were white. The man beside him drove with an economy of motion, his gaze fixed on the road, his presence filling the small car with a palpable sense of menace. Julian found himself studying the hitman's profile in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, the sharp line of his jaw, the deep-set eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wondered about the man's life, what series of events could lead a person to become a purveyor of death, a professional extinguisher of lives. But these were questions he dared not ask. Their relationship was transactional, and the less he knew, the safer he was. Silas dropped him at a bustling transit station on the edge of the city. Get a cab to your friend's place. Don't use a ride-sharing app. Cash only. Be seen. Be memorable. He instructed, his voice a low rasp. Create a digital footprint later tonight. Post something online from the cabin. Make it look like you're having the time of your life. With that, he was gone, melting back into the city's circulatory system, leaving Julian alone on the curb, the burner phone feeling like a lead weight in his pocket. He followed the instructions to the letter. He hailed a taxi, making friendly, forgettable small talk with the driver about the weather. He arrived at his friend Mark's apartment, the designated meeting point for their cabin trip, with a forced grin plastered on his face. Mark and the others, Chloe and Ben, were already in high spirits, loading a cooler with beer and food. They greeted Julian with boisterous enthusiasm, oblivious to the chasm that had opened between his outward appearance and his inner reality. "Jules, my man, ready to escape civilization," Mark boomed, slapping him on the back. "You have no idea," Julian replied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The 2-hour drive to the cabin was an exercise in sustained performance. Julian laughed at their jokes, contributed to their mindless chatter, and even managed to sing along to the music on the radio. He was an actor in the most important role of his life, and a single misstep could bring the entire production crashing down. He felt a profound sense of detachment, as if he were watching a movie of someone else's life. He saw his friends, happy and carefree, and felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name: envy, loss, a nostalgia for an innocence he had just irrevocably signed away. They arrived at the rustic cabin, nestled deep in the woods, well after dark. The air was crisp and cold, smelling of pine and damp earth. As his friends busied themselves with unpacking and starting a fire in the hearth, Julian found a quiet corner and, with trembling fingers, took out his own smartphone. He scrolled through his photos, found a picture of a sunset from a previous trip, and posted it to his social media accounts. Finally made it. The perfect weekend getaway with the best crew. Cabin life, no regrets. He captioned it. The last hashtag, a cruel private joke. He then turned the phone off and put it away. The first part of his alibi was now cemented in the digital world. Miles away, in the quiet, tree-lined street where Eleanor Vance lived, a different kind of preparation was underway. Silas had been observing the house for the better part of a week, his surveillance a model of professional patience. He knew the comings and goings of the neighbors, the schedule of the local police patrols, the precise moment the streetlights flickered on. He was a ghost, a shadow that moved unseen. He had parked his nondescript car several blocks away and approached the house from the rear, moving through the manicured backyards with a silent, fluid grace. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a ski mask. In a small, unassuming duffel bag, he carried the tools of his trade: a glass cutter, a pry bar, and several small, custom-made incendiary devices. These were not crude Molotov cocktails. They were sophisticated tools designed to start a fire that would look, to the untrained eye, like an electrical fault. They were packed with a chemical accelerant that would burn hot and fast, but would be difficult to detect in the charred remains. He vaulted the back fence with practiced ease, landing softly on the damp grass of Eleanor's award-winning garden. He crouched in the shadows of a large oak tree, the very tree from which a younger Julian had once hung a tire swing, and watched the house. The lights were on downstairs. He could see Eleanor's silhouette as she moved about in the kitchen. He checked his watch. 9:15 p.m. Everything was proceeding according to schedule. At precisely 9:30 p.m., the downstairs lights went out one by one, and a moment later, a small red light on a keypad near the back door blinked to life. The alarm was set. Silas waited. He knew from Julian's information that Eleanor would now be heading upstairs to her bedroom. He gave it another 30 minutes, allowing her time to settle in, to fall into the first deep sleep of the night. The point of entry was a small window in the basement, one that Julian had pointed out as having a faulty latch. It was child's play for Silas. A small, precise cut with the glass cutter, a gentle tap, and a section of the pane came away in his gloved hand. He reached in, unlocked the window, and slid it open. He slipped inside, his movements economical and silent. The basement was cool and musty, smelling of earth and time. He navigated through the clutter of a long-life old furniture draped in white sheets, boxes of forgotten memorabilia, a dusty wine rack. He found the electrical panel, a relic from the 1950s with its ceramic fuses and cloth-wrapped wiring. This would be the origin point, the place where the accidental fire would begin. He carefully placed one of the incendiary devices behind the panel, tucking it deep into the tangle of old wires. He didn't activate it yet. That would be the final step. He moved up the basement stairs, his feet making no sound on the old wooden treads. The ground floor was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The air was thick with the scent of lemon polish and potpourri, the smell of a life lived with meticulous order. He moved through the house with a predator's purpose, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, taking in the layout he had memorized from Julian's drawings. He saw the family photographs on the mantelpiece. Julian as a smiling boy, his handsome parents, a younger, vibrant Eleanor. He felt nothing. They were just part of the scenery, set dressing for the job at hand. His destination was the second floor. He took the main staircase, its plush runner muffling any sound he might make. He paused at the top, listening. From behind a closed door down the hall, he could hear the faint, regular sound of breathing. He approached the door to Eleanor's bedroom and slowly, carefully, turned the knob. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open a few inches. The room was illuminated by the soft glow of a nightlight. Eleanor was in bed, a frail figure under a mountain of quilts. Her silver hair fanned out on the pillow. She was asleep, her breathing deep and even. For a moment, she stirred, murmuring something in her sleep, and Silas froze, becoming one with the shadows. But she settled again, and the rhythm of her breathing returned. Silas did not enter the room. His method was impersonal. He placed a second incendiary device at the base of the bedroom door, wedging it tightly against the frame. This one was designed to ensure that the fire spread quickly to the upper floor, trapping the occupant. He then retreated, moving back through the house with the same spectral silence. Back in the basement, he made his final preparations. He took out a small, digital timer. He set it for 20 minutes. Enough time for him to be miles away before the first spark ignited. He armed the device behind the electrical panel, a small click echoing in the stillness. He then made his way back to the open window, slipped out into the garden, and carefully replaced the section of glass he had removed, using a piece of clear adhesive to hold it in place. It wouldn't stand up to close scrutiny, but it would be consumed by the fire long before anyone had a chance to examine it. He retraced his steps, melting back into the suburban darkness. As he walked briskly towards his car, he dropped the duffel bag, now empty of its sinister contents, into a public garbage can. He was a professional. He left nothing behind. 20 minutes later, back at the cabin, Julian was staring into the crackling flames of the fireplace. His friends were playing a raucous card game, their laughter echoing in the cozy room, but Julian couldn't focus. His mind was elsewhere, in a quiet, dark house miles away. He kept checking the time. Every tick of the clock was a step closer to the inevitable. He felt a nauseating mixture of anxiety and anticipation. And then it began. In the basement of Eleanor Vance's home, the timer on the incendiary device reached 0. A small, silent spark ignited a chemical compound, which in turn erupted into a burst of intense, white-hot flame. The old, cloth-wrapped wires, brittle with age, caught instantly. The fire latched onto the dry wooden beams of the subflooring, feeding on decades of dust and neglect. The fire spread with terrifying speed. It surged upwards, following the path of the electrical wiring through the walls, a hidden serpent of destruction. Within minutes, the ground floor was filled with thick, acrid smoke. The smoke detectors, old and battery-operated, began to shriek, their shrill cries piercing the silence of the night, but there was no one downstairs to hear them. Upstairs, the second device, the one outside Eleanor's bedroom, ignited. The wooden door, coated in layers of old paint, began to smolder, then burn. The fire licked at the doorframe, a hungry tongue tasting its next meal. The smell of smoke finally penetrated Eleanor's sleep. She awoke with a cough, her eyes stinging. The room was hazy, and a strange, orange light was flickering from under her bedroom door. Confusion warred with a rising panic. She pushed back the covers, her old, stiff joints protesting. The floor was warm beneath her bare feet. She stumbled towards the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached for the brass knob, and a jolt of searing pain shot up her arm. She cried out, snatching her hand back. The knob was blisteringly hot. The fire was right outside. Panic gave way to terror. She was trapped. She ran to the window, fumbling with the lock. It was an old, heavy sash window, and her frail arms struggled to lift it. With a surge of adrenaline, she finally forced it open, gasping for the clean, cool night air. Below her was a 20-foot drop to the flagstone patio. A jump was impossible. She screamed for help, her voice thin and reedy against the growing roar of the fire. The house was groaning around her, the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass. The smoke in her room was thick and black, stealing the air from her lungs. Her screams turned into racking coughs. Her vision swam. The last thing she saw was the portrait of her late husband on the wall, his smiling face obscured by a veil of black smoke, before she collapsed to the floor. The fire was a living, breathing entity now. It punched through the roof, sending a geyser of sparks and embers into the night sky. Windows exploded outwards from the intense heat. The grand Victorian home, a monument to a lifetime of order and propriety, was being consumed by a maelstrom of chaos and flame. A neighbor, woken by the sound of breaking glass, looked out his window and saw the inferno. The first 911 call was placed, a frantic, panicked report of a house fully engulfed in flames. Within minutes, the night was torn apart by the wail of sirens. Fire trucks, police cars, and an ambulance converged on the scene, their flashing lights painting the neighborhood in strobes of red and blue. Firefighters scrambled, hoses were unrolled, and powerful jets of water were directed at the raging fire. But they were too late. The blaze was too intense. The house's old, dry timber construction providing the perfect fuel. The roof collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks high into the air. The battle was no longer about saving the house. It was about preventing the fire from spreading to the neighboring properties. It took them hours to bring the blaze under control. As the sun began to rise, casting a sickly gray light on the scene, all that remained of the Vance home was a smoldering, blackened skeleton. Steam and smoke rose from the charred ruins, a funeral pyre in the heart of suburbia. Once the scene was cool enough to enter, 2 firefighters in heavy gear made their way carefully through the debris. They found what they were looking for, what they had feared they would find, in the charred remains of a second-floor bedroom. It was the body of an elderly woman, burned beyond recognition. Back at the cabin, Julian had finally succumbed to an exhausted, dreamless sleep. He was woken by Mark shaking his shoulder, his friend's face pale and grim. "Jules, wake up," Mark said, his voice unusually subdued. "You need to see this." He led a groggy Julian into the living room, where Chloe and Ben were huddled around a laptop, watching a news report. The screen showed the smoking ruins of a house that Julian knew with a sickening intimacy. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Fatal Fire Claims Life of Elderly Woman in Historic Home." Julian stared at the screen, his face a carefully constructed mask of shock and disbelief. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had known this was coming, he had planned it, paid for it. But seeing the smoldering shell of his home, the final, brutal confirmation of his actions, was a visceral shock. "Oh my God," he whispered, letting his knees buckle, sinking onto the couch. That's my grandmother's house." His friends rushed to his side, offering words of comfort, their faces etched with sympathy and horror. They had no idea they were comforting a monster. Julian buried his face in his hands, forcing out the dry, racking sobs of a grieving grandson. Inside, he felt nothing but a terrifying, echoing emptiness. The obstacle was gone. The gilded cage had been burned to the ground. He was finally free, or so he thought. The days following the fire were a masterfully executed performance of grief. Julian played the part of the devastated grandson to perfection. His friends, Mark, Chloe, and Ben, drove him back to the city, their car a cocoon of somber silence and whispered condolences. He was unreachable, his eyes vacant, his responses monosyllabic. He was the picture of a young man shattered by tragedy. He was met by a phalanx of concerned family, friends, and distant relatives, all offering sympathies and platitudes that he accepted with a hollowed-out expression. He was put up in a luxury hotel suite, the bill quietly handled by his grandmother's estate lawyer, a kind, elderly man named Mr. Abernathy, who had known Julian since he was a boy. The initial report from the fire marshal was exactly what Silas had promised and what Julian had hoped for. A tragic accident, the preliminary findings suggested. The fire appeared to have originated in the basement, near the antiquated electrical panel. The house's old wiring, combined with a possible power surge, was the likely culprit. It was a story that made perfect sense. Eleanor Vance, a beloved pillar of the community, had died in a freak accident, a sad but not altogether uncommon fate for the elderly living in historic homes. Julian handled the initial formalities with a detached efficiency that many mistook for shock-induced strength. He identified his grandmother's belongings, the few that had survived the blaze, mostly jewelry that had been kept in a fire-resistant safe. He met with Mr. Abernathy to discuss the will, a document that, as expected, named him the sole beneficiary of the Vance fortune. The numbers were staggering, far exceeding his most avaricious dreams. He was now a very, very wealthy man. But amidst the whirlwind of funeral arrangements and legal meetings, a quiet and meticulous investigation was beginning to take shape. The lead investigator was a man named Detective Harding, a veteran of the Arson squad with 20 years of experience and a deeply ingrained cynicism. Harding didn't believe in accidents. He believed in evidence. And something about the Vance fire didn't sit right with him. It was the intensity. The fire had burned too hot, too fast. An electrical fire, especially one starting in a basement, was typically a slow burn, a smoldering affair that would generate a great deal of smoke long before it became a full-blown inferno. This fire had behaved like a hungry beast, devouring the old house with a ferocity that suggested it had help. Harding's team began the painstaking process of sifting through the debris, a task akin to archaeological excavation. They worked in a grid, carefully removing layers of charred wood and ash, documenting and photographing everything. In the basement, near the melted remains of the electrical panel, a young, sharp-eyed investigator found something. A tiny, metallic fragment that didn't belong. It was sent to the lab for analysis. Harding's investigation also turned to the victim. An autopsy was performed on Eleanor Vance's remains. While the cause of death was officially listed as smoke inhalation, the medical examiner found something else. An unusually low level of carbon monoxide in her blood for a fire victim. This suggested she might have been unconscious or had already passed away before the smoke became truly dense, though the damage to her body made a definitive conclusion impossible. It was another small anomaly, another piece that didn't quite fit the tragic accident narrative. Harding's focus inevitably shifted to the sole heir, the grieving grandson. On the surface, Julian Vance was beyond reproach. His alibi was perfect. He was hours away at a cabin with 3 friends. His social media post, timestamped and geotagged, placed him far from the scene. His friends all corroborated his story, their sympathy for him palpable. Harding interviewed Julian in his hotel suite. The detective was calm, fatherly, his questions gentle. He expressed his condolences and asked Julian to walk him through the days leading up to the fire. Julian recounted his last conversation with his grandmother, his excitement about the cabin trip, his feigned contrition over his recent mistakes. He painted a picture of a loving, if sometimes strained, relationship. "Your grandmother, she was in good health?" Harding asked, his gaze steady. "Yes, for her age," Julian replied, his voice cracking slightly. "She was sharp as a tack. A little frail, maybe, but full of life. Any enemies? Anyone who might have wished her harm? Julian laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. My grandmother? Everyone loved her. She was a formidable woman, but she didn't have a malicious bone in her body. Harding nodded slowly, making a note in his pad. He didn't push. He knew that pushing a suspect too early only made them defensive. For now, he was just gathering string. The first real break came from the lab. The metallic fragment found in the basement was identified as part of a high-temperature chemical igniter, a component not found in residential electrical systems. More importantly, chemical analysis of the surrounding soot and debris revealed trace amounts of a sophisticated accelerant, one that was designed to burn off almost completely, leaving very little residue. The fire was no accident. It was arson. The investigation now became a homicide case. Harding's team began to dig deeper into the life of Julian Vance. They subpoenaed his bank records, his university transcripts, his phone records, and the carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The bank records revealed a young man living far beyond his generous allowance, with a pattern of large cash withdrawals and a trail of bounced checks. They uncovered the private investigator Eleanor had hired, and through him, the full extent of Julian's gambling debts. They found the loan shark, a man named Leo, who, under the threat of his own legal troubles, was more than willing to talk. He told them about Julian's desperation, about the increasingly large sums of money he had borrowed, including a final, substantial loan taken out just days before the fire. He said he had a big investment coming up. Leo sneered to the detectives, said it was a sure thing. I guess now we know what he meant. The digital trail also provided crucial clues. While Julian's personal phone had been off for much of the night of the fire, cell tower records showed its journey north, away from the city. But the investigators also discovered the existence of a second, unregistered burner phone. They tracked its purchase to a small, cash-only convenience store. Security footage from the store showed a young man matching Julian's description buying the phone 2 weeks before the fire. Painstakingly, they traced the burner phone's activity. It had made only a handful of calls, all to another unregistered number. And on the night of the fire, this burner phone had traveled north for an hour, stopped for 15 minutes on the side of a highway, the exact time and place where Julian claimed to be driving to the cabin, and then traveled back towards the city. It was the missing piece of the alibi, the digital ghost that proved Julian's deception. Harding brought Julian in for a second interview, this time not in the comfort of a hotel suite, but in a small, stark interrogation room at the police headquarters. The tone was no longer gentle. Harding laid out a series of photographs on the metal table between them. A picture of the chemical igniter. A photo of Julian from the convenience store security camera. A map showing the movements of the burner phone. We know, Julian, Harding said, his voice flat and hard. We know about the debts. We know about the loan shark. We know this was no accident. Julian's composure finally shattered. The blood drained from his face, and a visible tremor ran through his hands. He tried to lie, to deny, but his voice failed him. The weight of his crime, the pressure of the investigation, had become too much to bear. I didn't do it, he stammered, the words sounding weak even to his own ears. I was at the cabin. Ask my friends. We know you were there, Harding countered. But we also know where you were first. We know you met someone on that highway. Someone you paid to solve your problem. Julian stared at the evidence on the table, the undeniable proof of his intricate web of lies. The walls were closing in. There was no escape. And in a moment of self-preservation, of pure, cowardly panic, he made his final betrayal. He gave up Silas. He told them everything. The meetings, the payments, the plan. He didn't know the hitman's real name, but he gave them a detailed physical description, the type of car he drove, and the location of their final meeting point. Finding a ghost like Silas was not easy, but Julian had given them enough. A dedicated team of detectives worked the city's underbelly, shaking down informants, pulling surveillance footage from every camera within a 5-mile radius of the highway meeting spot. They got a partial license plate, which led them to a list of possible vehicles. Cross-referencing that with known associates of organized crime, They narrowed the list down to a handful of names. One of them, a man with a sealed juvenile record for arson and a long, violent history as a freelance enforcer, matched Julian's description perfectly. His real name was Michael Nowak, but on the street he was known as Silas. They tracked him to a nondescript apartment building and arrested him without incident. Silas, the consummate professional, remained silent. He offered no confession, no denial. He simply stared at the detectives with his cold, empty eyes, a man who understood the rules of the game. The trial was a media sensation. The story of the handsome, privileged grandson who had his grandmother murdered for money was the stuff of tabloid headlines. Julian, hoping for leniency, testified against Silas, recounting every sordid detail of their plot. He stood in the witness box, a shell of his former self, his tailored suit hanging off his now gaunt frame. He avoided looking at the jury, his voice a low monotone as he described his betrayal. His friends, Mark, Chloe, and Ben, sat in the gallery, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief as they listened to the man they thought they knew confess to a monstrous crime. The sympathy they once felt had curdled into revulsion. The jury found both men guilty. Silas, the remorseless professional, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He received his sentence with the same stony indifference he had shown throughout the trial. For Julian, the judge reserved his most scathing words. "You are a testament to a profound moral rot," he said, his voice thundering through the silent courtroom. "You were given every advantage in life, and you used it to commit the most heinous of acts. You did not just burn down a house, you incinerated a legacy. You did not just take a life, you murdered the woman who raised you, who loved you. You are a cancer on the heart of this community." Julian Vance was also sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in handcuffs, he finally looked up, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom. He saw no sympathy, no compassion. He saw only disgust and condemnation. The Vance fortune, the inheritance for which he had sold his soul, would be tied up in legal battles for years, eventually being awarded to a distant relative he had never met. In the end, Julian had achieved his freedom from the gilded cage, but had only traded it for a steel and concrete one. He would spend the rest of his life in a world devoid of lemon polish and old money, a world of clanging doors and the cold, hard reality of his choices. The fire he had started had not, in the end, cleansed anything. It had only consumed him, leaving nothing behind but the ashes of a wasted life and the slow, unending burn of justice.